In the winter of 1879, when city inspectors finally gained access to the sealed records of Pittsburgh's St. Thomas Hospital, they uncovered something that would haunt the medical community for decades. Over the course of 23 years, 67 patients had entered the hospital's divine healing ward. Not one ever walked out alive. Every single death certificate carried the same peculiar notation, called by God during sacred treatment. But the true horror lay not in the deaths themselves. It was in the meticulous documentation discovered hidden beneath the ward's chapel floorboards. Pages upon pages of detailed observations, measurements, and what seemed to be experimental procedures, all signed by three names: Dr. Charles Anderson, Sister Helen Murphy, and Chaplain Robert Walsh. The city buried the findings immediately, and by spring, all three had vanished without a trace. Before we continue with what really happened in that ward, we must note this channel is not for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest secrets of American history. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, the ones that reveal the horrifying truth behind closed doors. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. Subscribe and join our community of true mystery seekers. Tell us in the comments what state you are listening from. We want to know how far these dark American tales have traveled. The truth about St. Thomas Hospital's divine healing ward would challenge everything people believed about faith, medicine, and human decency in 19th-century America. Pittsburgh in 1856 was a city of contradictions. Steel mills belched black smoke into the sky while church bells rang across neighborhoods where German immigrants, Irish Catholics, and Protestant Americans lived in uneasy coexistence. The Industrial Revolution had brought prosperity to some. But for the growing population of factory workers, miners, and their families, life was often short and brutal. Disease ran rampant through cramped tenements, and medical care was a luxury few could afford. It was in this environment that Dr. Charles Anderson saw an opportunity. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Anderson had returned to his native Pittsburgh with ambitious plans. Unlike other physicians who served either the wealthy elite or catered to the poor through charity, Anderson envisioned something revolutionary, a hospital that would combine the latest medical knowledge with the healing power of faith. He believed divine intervention could work hand in hand with scientific medicine to achieve miraculous results. Anderson was a man of striking appearance, tall and lean, with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely silver hair that lent him an air of distinguished authority. He spoke with the fervor of a preacher and the precision of a scientist. His vision attracted two key allies who would become his partners in what would later be called the most sophisticated medical deception in Pennsylvania's history. Sister Helen Murphy had arrived in Pittsburgh from County Cork in 1848, part of the wave of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine. Unlike many of her countrymen who found work in the mills, Murphy secured a position at Mercy Hospital, where her natural compassion and quick intelligence made her one of the most trusted nurses in the city. She was a woman of deep faith, but also of practical wisdom. She understood suffering was a daily reality for Pittsburgh's working class, and she genuinely wanted to help alleviate it. Chaplain Robert Walsh represented the third pillar of Anderson's vision. A Methodist minister who had served congregations from Philadelphia to the Ohio frontier, Walsh had a reputation for powerful sermons and an almost hypnotic ability to comfort the dying. He was a man who truly believed in divine healing, having witnessed what he considered miraculous recoveries during his frontier ministry. Walsh was also a meticulous record keeper, a habit that would prove both essential to their work and ultimately their downfall. The three came together in the winter of 1855 when Anderson presented his proposal to the Pittsburgh Medical Society. St. Thomas Hospital would be different from any institution in America. It would have a standard medical wing for conventional treatments, but its centerpiece would be the Divine Healing Ward, a specialized unit where patients with terminal illnesses would receive blessed medical care, combining prayer, faith, and advanced medical techniques. The proposal was controversial. Orthodox physicians dismissed it as quackery, while many clergy worried about the mixing of sacred and secular healing. But Anderson had done his homework. He had studied the success of similar institutions in Europe, particularly in Germany, where some hospitals had begun experimenting with what they called holistic healing. He presented compelling statistics and testimonials from European colleagues who claimed remarkable success rates. More importantly, Anderson had secured financial backing from several prominent Pittsburgh families who had lost loved ones to diseases conventional medicine couldn't cure. The Carnegies, who had lost a young daughter to consumption, were particularly generous. The Mellons, devastated by the loss of their eldest son to typhoid fever, saw Anderson's vision as a way to prevent other families from experiencing their grief. By the spring of 1856, St. Thomas Hospital had been built on a wooded hill overlooking the Allegheny River. The main building was constructed of local sandstone with large windows designed to let in healing light. The Divine Healing Ward occupied the entire third floor with its own chapel, dedicated nursing station, and what Anderson called observation rooms for the most critical cases. The hospital's opening was celebrated throughout the city. Anderson had carefully cultivated relationships with journalists, clergy, and civic leaders. The Pittsburgh Gazette ran a series of articles praising the innovative approach to healing. Local ministers, despite initial skepticism, had been won over by Walsh's eloquent explanations of how prayer and medicine could work together in God's service. But from the very beginning, there were aspects of the Divine Healing Ward that remained hidden from public view. The observation rooms were accessible only to Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh. The ward's medical supplies were ordered separately from the main hospital, and records were kept in a private filing system no one else was allowed to examine. Most unusually, families of patients in the Divine Healing Ward were required to sign extensive legal documents granting the hospital complete authority over treatment decisions and prohibiting visits during sacred healing periods. These restrictions were explained as necessary for maintaining the spiritual environment required for divine healing. Families were told worldly concerns and emotional attachments could interfere with God's work. They were assured their loved ones were receiving the most advanced care available, guided by both medical expertise and divine wisdom. The ward's first patient was Margaret O'Brien, a seamstress from the Irish district who had been diagnosed with advanced consumption. She was 34 years old, the mother of 3 young children, and had been given less than a month to live by her previous doctor. Her husband Patrick, a steel worker, had spent his family's savings on medical bills with no improvement in his wife's condition. When he heard about the Divine Healing Ward, he saw it as Margaret's only hope. Margaret was admitted on June 15, 1856, with great ceremony. Anderson examined her personally, while Walsh led the family in prayer, and Murphy assured them Margaret would receive round-the-clock care. The family was told the healing process would require complete spiritual focus and that visits would be limited to prevent disruption of the divine work being done. What actually happened to Margaret O'Brien in those first days would not be discovered for over 2 decades. But according to the hidden records later found beneath the chapel floor, her treatment began immediately upon admission, and it bore no resemblance to anything that could be called healing. The morning of June 22, 1856, began like any other in the Divine Healing Ward, with prayers at sunrise and the gentle sound of hymns echoing through the corridors. But by evening, something had changed forever on the 3rd floor of St. Thomas Hospital. Margaret O'Brien, admitted with consumption just 1 week earlier, was found dead in her bed during morning rounds. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to advanced consumption occurred during divine healing prayer. But the circumstances surrounding her death would establish a pattern that would repeat 66 more times over the next 23 years. Sister Murphy discovered the body at 6:30 a.m. as she made her usual rounds with morning medications. Margaret lay peacefully in bed, her hands folded as if in prayer, her face bearing an expression Murphy would later describe to grieving families as divine serenity. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of pain or distress. It was, Murphy told Patrick O'Brien when he arrived that afternoon, exactly what one would expect from a soul called home to God. But what Patrick O'Brien wasn't told was that Margaret had been moved to one of the observation rooms 3 days earlier. These rooms, located at the far end of the ward, were accessible only through a corridor that required a special key held by Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh. The rooms were soundproofed, supposedly to provide absolute quiet for prayer and meditation. They contained not just beds, but also what Anderson called therapeutic apparatus, devices he claimed could measure the spiritual energy of healing prayer. The hidden records would later reveal Margaret's treatment in the observation room had been unlike anything practiced in conventional medicine. Detailed measurements of her pulse, temperature, and breathing patterns were taken every 2 hours. She was given experimental medications Anderson had acquired through correspondence with European physicians. Most disturbing of all, the records contained precise observations of how her body responded to different substances, including several known to be toxic in large doses. The entry for June 21, 1856, written in Anderson's meticulous handwriting, read, "Subject MO showing expected respiratory depression following administration of preparation number 7. Pulse weak but regular. Notable absence of pain response. Recommend continued observation through night cycle. RW to maintain vigil and document any changes." When Patrick O'Brien arrived the next afternoon, he found his wife laid out in the ward's main room, dressed in a clean white gown and surrounded by flowers. Anderson met him with solemn dignity, explaining Margaret had passed peacefully in her sleep after a night of particularly intense prayer. Walsh stood beside him, offering scriptural comfort about the divine plan and the blessed nature of those called home during sacred healing. The family was told Margaret's body had been prepared for burial according to the hospital's spiritual protocols. She had been bathed in blessed water and dressed in garments prayed over by the hospital's clergy. This preparation, they were told, was part of the hospital's commitment to honoring the divine nature of the healing process, even when God chose to call a soul home rather than restore it to earthly health. What the family didn't know was that Margaret's body had been the subject of an extensive post-mortem examination in the hospital's basement. The records described in clinical detail the effects of experimental medications on her organs, the progression of her disease, and the exact mechanism of her death. These findings were carefully documented and added to what Anderson called his research files. The funeral was held at St. Patrick's Church with Walsh delivering a moving eulogy about Margaret's faith and the mysterious ways of divine healing. The community mourned the loss of a young mother. But they also celebrated what they saw as the hospital's compassionate attempt to provide hope where conventional medicine had failed. Donations poured in from families touched by the hospital's mission, and several other terminal patients requested admission to the divine healing ward. But not everyone was convinced by the official story. Dr. James Mitchell, a Scottish physician practicing in Pittsburgh for 15 years, had known Margaret O'Brien through his work at the Free Clinic in the Irish district. He had examined her just 2 weeks before her admission to St. Thomas Hospital and had been surprised by her relatively stable condition. While her consumption was indeed advanced, Mitchell had expected her to live several more months, possibly longer with proper care. Mitchell's concerns deepened when he attempted to review Margaret's medical records. Anderson politely but firmly refused to share the files, explaining records of the divine healing ward were confidential due to their spiritual nature. The healing process, Anderson explained, involved not just medical observations, but spiritual insights and prayer records sacred to the hospital's mission. The confrontation between Mitchell and Anderson took place in the hospital's main office on July 3, 1856. Mitchell, a man known for his directness, demanded to know what treatments Margaret had received and why her condition had deteriorated so rapidly. Anderson, maintaining his calm demeanor, explained divine healing worked differently from conventional medicine. Sometimes, he said, God chooses to call a soul home as part of a larger plan mortal minds cannot comprehend. She was my patient for over a year, Mitchell argued, his Scottish accent thick with emotion. I know her condition, and I know what consumption looks like in its final stages. Something about this death doesn't align with the natural progression of her disease. Anderson's response was measured but firm. Dr. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but you must remember we are dealing with forces beyond conventional medical understanding. The divine healing ward operates according to principles that combine medical science with spiritual intervention. The results cannot always be explained by purely secular medicine. Sister Murphy, present for the conversation, added her own observations. I was with Margaret in her final hours, she said softly. She was at peace, Doctor. She spoke of visions of her mother calling her home. It was beautiful in its way. Sometimes the most merciful healing is the one that ends suffering by bringing a soul to eternal rest. Mitchell left the hospital that day with more questions than answers. He spoke privately with several other physicians in the city, but none were willing to challenge Anderson's methods publicly. The divine healing ward was popular with the community, and Anderson's reputation as an innovative physician was well established. More importantly, the hospital was providing a service no other institution offered, Hope for families facing terminal illness. The second death occurred just 6 weeks later. Thomas Brennan, a coal miner admitted with what appeared to be advanced lung disease, was found dead in his bed after 12 days in the Divine Healing ward. Like Margaret O'Brien, he had spent his final days in one of the observation rooms receiving what Anderson called intensive spiritual therapy. The pattern was becoming established, though no one outside the inner circle recognized it yet. Patients would be admitted to the Divine Healing ward with great hope and ceremony. They would receive initial treatment in the main ward with brief family visits. Then, as their condition allegedly worsened, they would be moved to the observation rooms for more intensive care. Within days, they would be found dead, always peacefully, always with the same expression of divine serenity. The hidden records showed a different story. Each patient had been subjected to experimental treatments, their responses carefully documented, their bodies examined after death. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were building a comprehensive database of human responses to various substances and procedures, all under the guise of divine healing. By the end of 1856, 5 patients had died in the Divine Healing ward. The hospital's public reputation remained sterling, but a small group of physicians and clergy in Pittsburgh were beginning to whisper questions about the ward's unusually high mortality rate. These questions would grow louder in the years to come, but never loud enough to penetrate the wall of respectability Anderson had built around his operation. The years following those first deaths brought subtle changes to St. Thomas Hospital that only the most observant visitors might have noticed. The Divine Healing ward's procedures became more refined, its privacy more absolute, and its reputation among Pittsburgh's desperate families more revered. By 1858, there was a waiting list for admission to the ward, with families traveling from as far as Ohio and West Virginia seeking the specialized care only Dr. Anderson and his team could provide. The hospital's success attracted attention from medical journals in Philadelphia and New York. Anderson published several papers on what he called integrative spiritual medicine, describing remarkable improvements in patient comfort and spiritual well-being, though he was notably vague about actual cure rates. His writing was eloquent and persuasive, filled with references to European medical advances and philosophical discussions about the connection between soul and body in the healing process. Sister Murphy had become something of a celebrity in Pittsburgh's Catholic community. Her reputation for compassionate care and her ability to comfort grieving families made her a sought-after speaker at church gatherings and charitable events. She spoke movingly about the privilege of serving those in their final moments, about the beauty of witnessing souls prepared for their journey to eternal rest. Her speeches were filled with genuine emotion, and her listeners left convinced St. Thomas Hospital's Divine Healing ward was a place of mercy and grace. Chaplain Walsh, meanwhile, developed a following among Pittsburgh's Protestant clergy. His sermons about divine healing drew large crowds, and his theological writings about the relationship between faith and medicine were circulated among ministers throughout western Pennsylvania. He had become an authority on what he called sacred medicine, arguing God worked through both prayer and medical knowledge to accomplish his healing will. But behind this public success, the true work of the Divine Healing ward was becoming increasingly sophisticated. The observation rooms had been equipped with more advanced measuring devices, some Anderson's own inventions. The hidden records showed the 3 conspirators had developed a systematic approach to their experiments, carefully selecting patients whose conditions would provide the most valuable data. The selection process was subtle but deliberate. Patients were chosen not just for their terminal diagnosis, but for their social circumstances. Priority was given to those whose families were poor, uneducated, or isolated, people unlikely to ask difficult questions or demand detailed explanations. Immigrants, particularly those with limited English, were especially targeted. The hospital's charity work in the Irish and German districts provided a steady stream of potential subjects. Mary Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who spoke little English, was admitted in March 1858 with what appeared to be stomach cancer. Her husband, Jan, worked in the steel mills and had been injured in an industrial accident that left him partially disabled. The family had no money for medical care, and Mary's condition was deteriorating rapidly. When a social worker from the hospital visited their cramped apartment and offered free treatment in the Divine Healing ward, Jan saw it as an answer to his prayers. Mary's case was typical of the ward's later operations. She was admitted with great ceremony, her treatment explained through a translator who was actually one of the hospital's staff members. The family was told Mary's condition required absolute rest and spiritual focus and that visits would be limited to prevent disruption of the healing process. Jan was allowed to see his wife twice during her 2-week stay, both times in the main ward area with staff members present. The hidden records for Mary's case were more detailed than those for earlier patients. Anderson had developed a systematic approach to testing experimental medications, carefully documenting dosages, timing, and physical responses. Mary was given a series of substances Anderson had acquired through correspondence with European physicians and chemical suppliers. Some were legitimate experimental medications. Others were compounds Anderson had synthesized himself in a small laboratory established in the hospital's basement. Mary's death was recorded as abdominal complications during prayer therapy, but the hidden records told a different story. She had been subjected to increasingly aggressive treatments as her condition worsened, with Anderson apparently using her deteriorating health as an opportunity to test the limits of human endurance. The final entry in her file, written in Anderson's careful handwriting, noted, "Subject MK provided excellent data on gastric absorption rates. Recommends similar protocols for future subjects with comparable presentations." The psychological toll of this work was beginning to show in different ways among the 3 conspirators. Anderson had become more detached and clinical, treating each patient as a research subject rather than a human being. His private journals, later discovered along with the medical records, revealed a man increasingly obsessed with the scientific value of his work and convinced the knowledge he was gaining justified the means used to acquire it. Sister Murphy, however, showed signs of internal conflict. Her public persona remained compassionate and caring, but those who knew her well noticed changes in her behavior. She had become more withdrawn, spending long hours in private prayer, and her formerly warm demeanor had acquired an edge of brittle intensity. The hidden records showed she was taking increasingly detailed notes about patients' emotional states and their responses to what she called spiritual comfort techniques. Walsh was perhaps the most disturbing of the 3 in his adaptation to their work. His faith appeared to have evolved into something darker and more complex. His private writings, found among the papers beneath the chapel floor, revealed a man who had convinced himself their work was actually a form of divine service. He had developed elaborate theological justifications for using dying patients as experimental subjects, arguing their suffering was serving a higher purpose that would ultimately benefit humanity. By 1860, 12 patients had died in the Divine Healing Ward. The hospital's public reputation remained excellent, but a small network of physicians and clergy in Pittsburgh privately expressed concerns about the ward's practices. Dr. Mitchell, who had questioned Margaret O'Brien's death, continued to raise questions about the ward's methods, though he was careful to avoid direct accusations. The concerns reached a crescendo in late 1860 when Drive Heinrich Zimmermann, a German physician recently arrived in Pittsburgh, attempted to visit a patient in the Divine Healing Ward. Zimmermann had been treating Klaus Baer, a German blacksmith, for what appeared to be kidney disease. When Baer's family decided to admit him to the Divine Healing Ward, Zimmermann requested permission to continue monitoring his patient's condition. Anderson's refusal to allow Zimmermann access to Baer led to a heated confrontation in the hospital's main lobby. Zimmermann, speaking in heavily accented English, demanded to know why a fellow physician was being denied the opportunity to observe his patient's care. Anderson, maintaining diplomatic composure, explained the Divine Healing Ward operated according to specialized protocols requiring absolute privacy and spiritual focus. "This is not medical practice," Zimmermann declared, his voice carrying throughout the lobby. "This is hiding behind religion to avoid scrutiny. I have been a physician for 20 years and I have never seen such secrecy in a place of healing." The confrontation might have led to a formal investigation, but external events intervened. The Civil War erupted in 1861, and Pittsburgh's medical community was consumed with treating wounded soldiers and dealing with the massive disruption to civilian life. Dr. Zimmermann enlisted as a military surgeon and left the city, taking his concerns about the Divine Healing Ward with him. The war years provided perfect cover for the ward's operations. The hospital's main floors were converted to treat wounded soldiers, and the Divine Healing Ward was presented as a specialized facility for civilians with conditions that couldn't be treated in the military wards. The chaos of wartime made it easy to maintain the secrecy Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh required. But the war also brought new opportunities. Wounded soldiers expected to die from their injuries were sometimes quietly transferred to the divine healing ward for what was described as spiritual comfort in their final hours. The hidden records showed these soldiers became subjects for experiments related to trauma, blood loss, and the effects of various pain medications. The most chilling aspect of the war years was the expansion of the operation. Anderson began corresponding with physicians in other cities, sharing his research findings and offering to provide detailed protocols for similar programs. The hidden records contained letters from doctors in Baltimore, Richmond, and even New York expressing interest in Anderson's methods and requesting information about establishing their own spiritual healing programs. By 1865, when the war ended, 28 patients had died in the divine healing ward. The hospital's reputation had never been higher, and Anderson had become recognized as one of the foremost authorities on spiritual medicine in America. But the foundation of their operation was beginning to show cracks that would eventually lead to their downfall. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Father Patrick O'Malley, the priest who had conducted funeral services for many of the ward's patients, began to notice disturbing patterns in the bodies he was preparing for burial. Too many of the deceased showed signs of what appeared to be medical procedures inconsistent with the spiritual healing they had supposedly received. O'Malley's concerns were shared with Bishop James Walsh, no relation to Chaplain Walsh, who decided to conduct a quiet investigation into the hospital's practices. The bishop's inquiry would prove to be the beginning of the end for the divine healing ward, though it would take more than a decade for the full truth to emerge. The bishop's investigation began in the autumn of 1865, conducted with the discretion the Catholic Church had perfected over centuries of navigating sensitive situations. Bishop James Walsh was a careful man who understood accusations against a respected medical institution required irrefutable evidence. He assigned Father O'Malley to document his observations more systematically while also reaching out to other clergy who had conducted funeral services for patients from the divine healing ward. What they discovered was a pattern of physical evidence contradicting the hospital's claims about spiritual healing. Too many bodies showed signs of needle marks, surgical incisions, and other medical interventions inconsistent with prayer-based treatment. Most disturbing were cases where patients had apparently died from causes unrelated to their original illnesses, death suggesting experimentation rather than natural disease progression. Father O'Malley's private journal, later discovered in the church archives, contained detailed observations. The Murphy woman, he wrote, referring to Bridget Murphy, no relation to Sister Murphy, who died in 1864, showed evidence of multiple puncture wounds on her arms and torso. When I asked Sister Murphy about these marks, she explained they were from spiritual therapy needles used to channel healing energy. But the pattern and depth of these wounds suggested something far more invasive than any spiritual practice I have witnessed. The investigation expanded in 1866 when Dr. Samuel Clark, a young physician recently completing his studies at Harvard Medical School, joined the staff at St. Thomas Hospital. Clark was assigned to work in the general medical wards, but his proximity to the divine healing ward gave him opportunities to observe the operation outsiders never had. Clark was immediately struck by unusual protocols surrounding the ward. Medical supplies were ordered separately. Patient records were kept in a locked filing system, and nursing staff who worked in the ward were forbidden from discussing their duties with other hospital personnel. Most suspicious was the fact the ward's mortality rate was exactly 100%. Every patient admitted died despite the hospital's claims about miraculous healing. Clark's medical training taught him to think scientifically about disease and treatment. He began keeping private records of observations about the divine healing ward, noting patterns in patient admissions, duration of stays, and circumstances of death. His notes, written in a coded system developed during his medical studies, would later provide crucial evidence about the ward's operations. The breakthrough came in early 1867 when Clark managed to gain access to one of the observation rooms during a night shift. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were attending a medical conference in Philadelphia, and the hospital's regular security procedures were more relaxed than usual. Clark used his master key to enter the restricted area of the ward, ostensibly to check on a patient moved there the previous day. What he found in the observation room shattered his understanding of what was happening in the divine healing ward. The room contained not just a bed for patient care, but an extensive array of medical instruments, measuring devices, and what appeared to be experimental apparatus. There were vials of various substances, some labeled with chemical formulas Clark didn't recognize, others marked only with numerical codes. The patient in the room was Thomas Kowalski, a Polish immigrant admitted with what appeared to be tuberculosis. But the man Clark found was barely conscious, showing signs of severe drug intoxication. His breathing was labored, his pulse weak and irregular, and his skin showed evidence of multiple injections. A detailed chart at the foot of his bed documented hourly measurements of vital signs along with notes about responses to various treatments. Clark's medical training told him Thomas Kowalski was dying not from tuberculosis, but from systematic poisoning. The substances being administered were not healing medications, but experimental compounds destroying his body's ability to function. The chart at the foot of his bed wasn't a medical record, it was a research log documenting the progress of a human experiment. The most chilling discovery was a notebook left open on a table beside the bed. Written in Anderson's handwriting, it contained detailed observations about Kowalski's responses to different doses of various substances. The entries were coldly clinical, treating the dying man as nothing more than a research subject. The final entry, dated the previous day, read, "Subject TK showing expected neurological depression. Recommend increasing dose of compound B23 to observe complete systemic breakdown." Clark realized he was witnessing not healing, but murder disguised as medicine. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't treating patients, it was using them as experimental subjects, documenting their responses to various substances and procedures until they died. The spiritual healing was an elaborate cover story designed to prevent scrutiny of systematic human experimentation. The young physician faced an impossible choice. He could report what he had discovered, but doing so would require admitting he had violated hospital security protocols and gained unauthorized access to restricted areas. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were respected members of the medical community, while Clark was a recent graduate with no established reputation. His accusations would likely be dismissed as fantasies of an inexperienced physician seeking attention. Clark decided to continue his investigation, gathering more evidence before making accusations. He began paying closer attention to the ward's operations, documenting patterns in patient admissions and deaths. He also started building relationships with other hospital staff, hoping to find allies who might have observed suspicious activities. His efforts led to a connection with Margaret Flanagan, a young Irish woman who worked as a cleaning girl in the hospital. Margaret had been assigned to clean the Divine Healing Ward during night shifts, and she had observed activities that troubled her deeply. She had seen patients move to observation rooms when they appeared to be getting better, not worse. She had witnessed Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh conducting procedures that looked nothing like prayer or spiritual healing. Margaret's observations were limited by her education and position in the hospital hierarchy, but her instincts told her something terrible was happening. She had tried raising concerns with her supervisor, but was told the spiritual healing process was beyond the understanding of uneducated workers and her job was to clean, not observe or question. The connection between Clark and Margaret proved crucial to understanding the full scope of the operation. Margaret's access to the ward during night shifts provided opportunities to observe activities hidden from other staff. Clark's medical knowledge allowed him to interpret what Margaret saw and understand the significance of equipment and procedures she described. Together, they began piecing together a picture of systematic human experimentation operating under the guise of spiritual healing for over a decade. The observation rooms were actually laboratories where terminal patients were used as test subjects for experimental medications and procedures. The detailed records kept by Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh weren't spiritual journals, they were scientific data documenting effects of various substances on human subjects. The motivation behind the operation was becoming clear. Anderson's correspondence with European physicians wasn't just about sharing knowledge, it was about selling research data. Experimental results gathered from the Divine Healing Ward were compiled into reports sold to pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions in Europe and America. The patients who died weren't just victims of medical experimentation, they were unwitting contributors to a profitable business in human research data. The scale was staggering. By 1867, 34 patients had died, and hidden records showed each death contributed to an expanding database of human research information. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh had developed standardized protocols for testing different substances and procedures, turning the ward into what amounted to a human laboratory. But the investigation Clark and Margaret conducted wasn't the only threat. The Catholic Church's inquiry, led by Bishop Walsh and Father O'Malley, was also gathering evidence. The bishop began sharing concerns with other religious leaders in Pittsburgh, and word spread through the city's clergy about suspicious activities at St. Thomas Hospital. The convergence of these investigations was about to bring the truth into the open, but consequences would be far more complex and disturbing than anyone imagined. The systematic human experimentation hidden behind spiritual healing was about to be revealed. But the full scope of the operation and its connections to the broader medical community would prove even more shocking than the original crimes. The winter of 1867 brought an unexpected crisis testing the carefully constructed facade of the Divine Healing Ward. Dr. William Harrison, a prominent physician from New York and personal friend of Andrew Carnegie, arrived in Pittsburgh to visit his sister, admitted to the ward with advanced consumption. Harrison was not the kind of family member Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh were accustomed to dealing with. He was educated, wealthy, and accustomed to demanding detailed explanations about medical treatment. Harrison's sister, Elizabeth, was a widow who moved to Pittsburgh to live with her daughter's family. Diagnosed with consumption by the family's regular physician, the disease progressed more rapidly than expected. When the family learned about the Divine Healing Ward's reputation for providing comfort to terminal patients, they arranged admission, believing the combination of medical care and spiritual healing would provide the best possible outcome. Dr. Harrison arrived at the hospital on a cold February morning, expecting to find his sister receiving innovative treatment that made St. Thomas Hospital famous. Instead, he met the same restrictions and explanations used to manage other families. Elizabeth was in a critical phase requiring absolute privacy and spiritual focus, and visits were limited to prevent disruption of the healing process. Harrison's medical training and professional status made him far more challenging to manage than typical family members. He demanded detailed information about his sister's treatment, asked pointed questions about protocols, and insisted on speaking with physicians responsible for her care. Anderson met with him personally, but the conversation went badly from the start. "Dr. Anderson, I appreciate your hospital's reputation for innovative treatment," Harrison began, tone professional but firm. "However, I am concerned about restrictions on family visits. In my experience, family support is crucial for patient recovery, particularly in cases of advanced consumption." Anderson's response was polished but evasive. "Dr. Harrison, I understand your concern as both physician and family member. However, the Divine Healing Ward operates according to specialized protocols developed over many years. The combination of medical treatment and spiritual healing requires an environment of complete tranquility and focus." "I'm not questioning your methods," Harrison replied. "But I would like to understand them better. What specific treatments is my sister receiving? What medications are being administered? What is the expected timeline for recovery?" The question struck at the heart of the deception protecting the ward for over a decade. Anderson found himself unable to provide detailed medical information Harrison requested without revealing the true nature of treatments. His responses became increasingly vague and defensive, raising Harrison's suspicions. The confrontation escalated when Harrison demanded to see his sister immediately regardless of protocols. Anderson refused, explaining Elizabeth was in a critical phase that could not be interrupted. Harrison threatened to remove his sister and transfer her to a facility in New York for conventional treatment. The crisis forced Anderson to make a dangerous decision. Rather than risk having Harrison remove his sister and potentially expose the ward's methods, he decided to allow a carefully managed visit. Elizabeth was moved from the observation room where she underwent experimental treatment to a room in the main ward area where she could be presented as receiving conventional spiritual healing. But damage had already been done. When Harrison finally saw his sister, his medical training immediately told him something was terribly wrong. Elizabeth was in severe drug intoxication, showing symptoms having nothing to do with consumption. Her pupils were dilated, speech slurred, and skin showed evidence of multiple injection sites unexplainable by conventional lung disease treatment. Harrison's examination took place in Sister Murphy's presence, who attempted to explain Elizabeth's condition as intensive spiritual therapy combined with blessed medications working differently from conventional drugs. But Harrison's expertise allowed him to recognize signs of systematic drug administration, and his growing alarm was evident. "What exactly are these blessed medications you've been giving my sister?" Harrison demanded, professional composure cracking. "These symptoms suggest opiate intoxication combined with mercury poisoning. This is not treatment of consumption. This is systematic drugging." Sister Murphy's response revealed strained years of deception placed on conspirators. Her usual calm demeanor faltered as she struggled to provide explanations satisfying a trained physician. "Dr. Harrison, medications we use are specially prepared according to protocols developed by Dr. Anderson in consultation with European specialists. The spiritual aspect sometimes produces effects appearing unusual to those unfamiliar with our methods." But Harrison was no longer listening to explanations. He conducted a thorough medical examination of his sister, documenting evidence later proving crucial to exposing operations. Elizabeth's condition was consistent with someone subjected to experimental drug administration over an extended period. Injection sites on arms and torso followed patterns suggesting systematic testing of different substances at different dosages. Most damning was Elizabeth's mental state. During brief moments of clarity between drug-induced stupors, she spoke of treatments bearing no resemblance to spiritual healing. She described being taken to a special room where doctors administered injections, making her feel strange and disconnected. She spoke of being asked how medications made her feel and having responses carefully written in notebooks. Harrison realized his sister had been a victim of human experimentation disguised as medical treatment. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't providing spiritual healing, it was using terminal patients as test subjects for experimental drugs and procedures. The high mortality rate wasn't divine will calling souls home, it was the inevitable outcome of systematic poisoning. The confrontation following would later be described by hospital staff as the most intense conflict in St. Thomas Hospital's history. Harrison demanded immediate access to his sister's medical records, threatened involving police, and vowed exposing practices to the medical community. Anderson, realizing the operation was in immediate danger of exposure, made a decision proving his fatal mistake. Instead of allowing Harrison to remove his sister and potentially exposing operations, Anderson decided to silence the threat permanently. Elizabeth Harrison died that night, officially from respiratory failure due to advanced consumption, but hidden records later revealed she had been given a massive dose of a substance Anderson tested for effects on the respiratory system. Harrison's grief was compounded by certainty his sister had been murdered. He demanded an autopsy, but Anderson's influence with the city's medical examiner ensured the request was denied. The official cause of death stood, and Elizabeth was buried in Allegheny Cemetery with a funeral service praising the hospital's compassionate attempt to provide comfort. But Harrison didn't accept the official explanation. He began his own investigation, using connections in the medical community to gather information about hospital practices. His inquiries reached Dr. Clark, who had been conducting his own secret investigation, and the two physicians began sharing concerns. The alliance between Harrison and Clark proved the beginning of the end. Harrison's medical expertise and professional connections provided credibility for Clark's observations, while Clark's position within the hospital gave access to information Harrison couldn't obtain as an outsider. Together, they began building a case, eventually exposing the full scope. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church's investigation intensified. Bishop Walsh shared concerns with the Archbishop of Philadelphia, who began his own inquiry. The Church's investigation proceeded cautiously, but evidence gathered by Father O'Malley became increasingly difficult to ignore. The convergence created a dangerous situation. Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh faced scrutiny from multiple directions, and usual methods of managing suspicious family members were no longer sufficient. The death of Elizabeth Harrison eliminated one immediate threat, but created new enemies determined to expose truth. Strain of maintaining deception showed in all three conspirators. Anderson became increasingly paranoid, convinced hospital staff were spying. He installed additional locks on observation rooms and restricted access further, creating an atmosphere of secrecy attracting unwanted attention. Sister Murphy showed signs of psychological breakdown. Her public persona remained composed, but those working closely noticed dramatic behavior changes. She began talking to herself during night shifts, and several staff reported hearing her crying in the chapel during prayer sessions. Weight of participating in dozens of murders took a toll she struggled to hide. Chaplain Walsh responded to pressure by becoming even more convinced of righteousness. Private writings from this period revealed a man completely losing touch with moral reality. He developed elaborate theological justifications, arguing patients who died were martyrs whose suffering served God's plan to advance medical knowledge for humanity's benefit. The breaking point came spring 1868 when Drive Clark made a discovery finally providing evidence needed to expose the operation. During nighttime observations, he discovered the entrance to Anderson's basement laboratory, a facility containing not just experimental equipment, but detailed records of every patient who died. The laboratory was sophisticated, rivaling major medical institutions. Anderson invested substantial resources acquiring advanced equipment, much imported from European suppliers. There were devices measuring physiological responses, apparatus synthesizing chemical compounds, and an extensive library of medical texts and journals dealing with experimental pharmacology. But most damning evidence was Anderson's research files. Detailed records of every experiment were meticulously documented, including precise descriptions of substances administered, physiological responses observed, and exact causes of death. Files revealed the operation had been far more systematic and extensive than imagined. Records showed Anderson corresponded with pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions throughout Europe and America, selling detailed reports on human responses to experimental drugs. Patients who died unwittingly contributed to a database of human research information used to develop new medications and treatments. Their deaths had been profitable as well as scientifically valuable. Most shocking was discovery the operation extended beyond St. Thomas Hospital. Anderson's correspondence revealed he provided protocols and guidance to physicians in other cities interested in establishing similar programs. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a network using terminal patients as research subjects under spiritual healing guises. The final confrontation began night of October 15, 1868, when Dr. Clark made a discovery bringing 23 years of systematic murder to light. While conducting surveillance, he witnessed Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh moving a large wooden crate from the basement laboratory to a waiting carriage outside the hospital's rear entrance. The crate was heavy enough to require all three to carry, handled with careful precision of people moving something extremely valuable. Clark followed the carriage through Pittsburgh's darkened streets, maintaining distance to avoid detection while keeping the vehicle in sight. The carriage traveled through the industrial district, past steel mills and factories belching smoke into night sky, finally stopping at a warehouse near the Ohio River. What Clark witnessed there would haunt him the rest of his life. Inside the warehouse, Anderson's operation revealed true scope. The building contained not just storage, but a sophisticated laboratory dwarfing the facility beneath the hospital. There were dozens of specimen jars containing what appeared to be human organs, extensive chemical apparatus, and filing cabinets filled with research documents. Most horrifying were bodies, dozens preserved in various states for clearly ongoing anatomical study. Clark realized patients who died hadn't simply been murdered for experimental purposes. Their bodies had been systematically harvested for organs and tissue samples sold to medical institutions throughout the country. The operation wasn't just testing experimental drugs, it was a comprehensive human research program treating patients as raw material for scientific study. The confrontation began when Clark attempted to leave and accidentally knocked over chemical apparatus. The sound alerted Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh to his presence, finding him attempting escape through a rear door. The three conspirators realized their operation had been discovered by someone understanding exactly what he saw. "Dr. Clark," Anderson said, voice carrying same calm authority convincing hundreds of families to entrust loved ones to his care. "I'm surprised to find you here. This is a private research facility, not open to unauthorized visitors." Clark's response revealed the full extent of his investigation. "I know what you've been doing, Anderson. I've seen the laboratory beneath the hospital. I've read research files and know about patients you've murdered. This operation ends tonight." The conversation following was recorded in Clark's private journal written immediately after events. Anderson made no attempt denying accusations. Instead, launching into passionate defense revealing twisted logic justifying 23 years of systematic murder. "You don't understand significance of what we've accomplished," Anderson argued. "Knowledge gained has advanced medical science by decades. Medications and treatments developed from our data will save thousands of lives. These patients were dying anyway. We simply ensured their death served greater purpose. Sister Murphy's response was more chilling. Those people came seeking spiritual healing and found it. We provided ultimate healing, release from earthly suffering, and privilege of contributing to God's plan advancing human knowledge. Their sacrifice was beautiful in its way. Chaplain Walsh offered most disturbing justification. The divine plan works through human instruments, Dr. Clark. We were chosen to conduct sacred work, gather knowledge God intends humanity to possess. Every patient who died was a willing participant in a holy mission transcending earthly understanding. Clark realized he dealt with 3 people completely losing touch with moral reality. Years justifying murder as medical research and spiritual service created a psychological framework allowing them to view victims as willing participants in a noble cause. They genuinely believed serving both science and God through systematic killing. The confrontation escalated when Clark attempted leaving to report discoveries to authorities. Anderson, realizing exposure inevitable, made the decision, finally bringing operation to light. Instead of attempting silencing Clark, he chose destroying evidence usable against them. Anderson began systematically destroying research files, pouring chemical accelerants over documents and specimens representing decades of work. The fire resulting would not only destroy evidence, but alert Pittsburgh Fire Department and police to warehouse existence and contents. But Anderson made a fatal miscalculation. In haste destroying evidence, he forgot research files hidden beneath chapel floor at St. Thomas Hospital. Those documents, along with laboratory equipment in hospital's basement, would provide all evidence needed exposing full scope. The warehouse fire brought investigators within hours. What found in partially destroyed facility was enough launching comprehensive investigation into St. Thomas Hospital and Divine Healing Ward. Preserved bodies, research equipment, and partially burned documents told a story of systematic human experimentation shocking even experienced investigators. Dr. Harrison, contacted by Clark earlier that evening, arrived as investigation beginning. Evidence found confirmed worst suspicions about his sister's death and provided proof needed exposing operation to medical community and press. The investigation following would reveal true scope. 67 patients died over 23 years. Each victim of systematic experimentation hidden behind spiritual healing facade. Research data gathered from murders sold to pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions throughout world, generating substantial profits. But most shocking revelations still to come. Investigation would uncover evidence operation extended far beyond St. Thomas Hospital, involving a network of physicians and institutions conducting similar experiments under various covers throughout United States and Europe. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't an isolated case of medical evil, it was part of a systematic program of human experimentation operating decades. The dawn of October 16, 1868 brought an end to one of most horrific medical deceptions in American history. But also revealed true scope of evil hidden behind Divine Healing Ward's spiritual healing facade. As Pittsburgh police and federal investigators combed evidence found at warehouse and hospital, full magnitude of Anderson, Murphy, and Walsh's crimes became clear. Hidden research files discovered beneath chapel floor contained meticulous documentation of every patient who died. Each file included detailed medical histories, experimental protocols, physiological observations, and post-mortem findings. Records revealed 67 deaths weren't random murders, but part of systematic research program designed testing human endurance limits and gathering data on experimental medications and procedures. Most damning were financial records showing operations' true motivation. Anderson sold research reports to pharmaceutical companies in Germany, France, and England, earning substantial sums for detailed documentation of human responses to experimental drugs. Patients who died unknowingly contributed to developing medications used throughout world. Their suffering transformed into profit for killers. Investigation also revealed sophisticated network supporting operation. Anderson corresponded with physicians in Baltimore, Richmond, New York, and London, sharing protocols and providing guidance establishing similar programs. The Divine Healing Ward wasn't an isolated case, it was flagship operation of larger network conducting human research under various covers throughout medical world. Sister Murphy found dead in her quarters morning of October 17, apparently taking her life with same substances used killing patients. Her suicide note, written in careful handwriting, revealed psychological toll years participating in systematic murder took on conscience. "I can no longer bear weight of what we have done," she wrote. "I believed serving God's plan, that knowledge gathered would serve humanity's greater good. But see now serving only pride and greed. Faces of those died trusting our care haunt day and night. May God forgive evil done in His name." Chaplain Walsh arrested at his home in Pittsburgh's Presbyterian district, where investigators found extensive theological writings revealing how justified murders as divine service. Personal library contained detailed studies of religious martyrdom and sacrifice with elaborate theological arguments attempting proving victims willing participants in God's plan advancing human knowledge. During interrogation, Walsh showed no remorse, maintaining he and co-conspirators divinely chosen conducting research. "We were instruments of divine will," he insisted. "Knowledge gathered benefit humanity generations. Those died achieved immortality through contribution to medical science." Dr. Anderson vanished night of warehouse fire, never seen again. Some investigators believed died in blaze, others suspected escaped continuing work elsewhere. Correspondence with European physicians suggested prepared escape routes and alternative identities allowing continuing research other locations. Search for Anderson led investigators discovering full-extent network created. Physicians in 6 different cities found conducting similar experiments under various covers, from spiritual healing programs to experimental charity clinics. Investigation expanded involving federal authorities and international law enforcement agencies, revealing systematic exploitation of terminal patients for medical research far more widespread than imagined. Families of 67 victims faced devastating realization loved ones not died peacefully during spiritual healing, but systematically murdered as part profitable research program. Patrick O'Brien, whose wife Margaret first victim 1856, led families demanding justice and compensation. "They told us loved ones in God's hands," O'Brien said public meeting at St. Patrick's Church. "But actually in hands of devils using suffering making money. We trusted with most precious treasures, turned trust into profit and pain." Legal proceedings following complex and lengthy. Chaplain Walsh convicted multiple murder counts, sentenced life imprisonment, though died cell 2 years later apparently natural causes. Physicians part Anderson's network faced various charges, some fleeing country before arrested. Pharmaceutical companies and medical institutions purchased research data faced civil lawsuits and public condemnation, though many argued unaware how data obtained. Legal battles continued years, some families eventually receiving financial settlements, though no money compensate horror loved ones endured. St. Thomas Hospital closed permanently December 1868, reputation destroyed revelations. Building eventually sold. City Pittsburgh converted offices municipal services, though many residents believed structure should demolished entirely. Chapel, where research files hidden, sealed, basement laboratory filled concrete preventing accessing site so much evil conducted. Broader impact extended far beyond Pittsburgh. Medical societies throughout United States implemented new oversight procedures, experimental treatments, several states passing laws requiring detailed documentation and approval any research involving human subjects. Scandal also led increased scrutiny spiritual healing programs and alternative medical treatments claiming combining faith and science. Catholic Church investigation led Bishop Walsh and Father O'Malley resulted new guidelines clergy involvement medical treatment. Church issued formal statement condemning religious faith cover medical experimentation, establishing procedures investigating suspicious deaths occurring spiritual healing. Dr. Clark, whose investigation crucial exposing operation, left Pittsburgh establishing practice Boston, becoming leading advocate medical ethics and patient rights. Writings about scandal published medical journals throughout world, helping establish ethical frameworks guiding medical research today. Margaret Flanagan, cleaning girl whose observations helped Clark gather evidence, offered position nurse Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital, completing training becoming respected advocate patient safety. Testimony about activities witnessed crucial prosecution's case Chaplain Walsh. This mystery shows horrifying potential evil exists when trust betrayed and suffering exploited profit. Divine Healing Ward scandal revealed how easily respected institutions hide systematic cruelty behind compassion and service facades. Reminds vigilance and skepticism necessary safeguards against exploiting vulnerable gain. Families lost loved ones never fully recovered betrayal experienced. Entrusted most precious treasures people believe dedicated healing and spiritual service, discovering loved ones systematically murdered prophet. Psychological trauma revelation many ways worse original grief losing family member terminal illness. Yet scandal also demonstrated power persistence and courage exposing evil. Dr. Clark's willingness risking career investigating suspicious activities, Father O'Malley's determination documenting evidence despite institutional pressure, Dr. Harrison's refusal accepting official explanations all contributed bringing truth light. Efforts ensured 67 victims not died vain, deaths ultimately led reforms protecting countless patients similar exploitation. Empty building once housed St. Thomas Hospital still stands hill overlooking Allegheny River, though renovated extensively now serves Pittsburgh's municipal archives. Visitors often report inexplicable sense unease areas once housed Divine Healing Ward, though third floor completely rebuilt bearing no resemblance original configuration. Cemetery where many victims buried became place pilgrimage those interested history medical ethics and patient rights. Memorial erected 1,895 bears names all 67 victims, includes inscription, in memory those suffered trust, and commitment ensuring such betrayal never occurs again.